Oh, greetings to the members of the society and any guests who might have joined in. Let me begin by saying what a pleasure and a great honor it has been for me to give. It is for me to give this presentation at the end of my 2-year stint as president of the society, and I must give a heartfelt vote of thanks to all the very hardworking members of the Society's Council who gave me so much support, and I hope I managed to be of some service. Well, time's short, so without further ado, let me jump straight into the presentation on the praise of diffusion, in praise of diffusion, and I want to describe to you the diffusion of innovation theory and how it can perhaps be applied and be useful in South African archaeology. Um, Basically have three components to this talk. The first one, I think the longest one, is to give a description of the diffusion of innovation theory with a couple of case studies just to clarify the main points. And then I'll apply it in an exercise to an archaeological case study, archaeological and historical case study concerning the diffusion of maize into Africa and South Africa specifically. And then I would like to end with a short epilogue on how the diffusion of innovation theory might also help us understand where the discipline of archaeology might be heading to in South Africa. So, without further ado, let me get started with the slideshow. Started with what is DOI, short for diffusion of innovations. Well, this is a theory that seeks to explain how, why, and at what rate new ideas and technologies spread through social systems. Basically, then it seeks to explain social change, something that's very important for archaeologists, of course. The theory was founded by Everett Rogers, and the first edition of his book dates back to 1962. The fifth edition is current, I think, um, and it's well worth a read. I can highly recommend this book. It's packed with interesting information. So, what is DOI? It can provide a fresh perspective on the interpretation of archaeological data, I think, and as I said, perhaps shed some light on the future of archaeology in South Africa. First, then, what are innovations? What do we mean by the word? One hears it a lot these days. Very basically, innovations are new methods, ideas, or products. That's all. Um, and if you think about it, if you look around you, wherever you're sitting, standing, every man made object you see around you is an innovation that successfully diffused and gained many adopters. Uh, every man made object that we see around us at some point in time didn't exist. And then somebody invented it. It became an innovation. It got pushed by various people along its spread, along its diffusionary spread. And the successful ones went very far and wide and went very quickly, perhaps, and have been adopted by a great many people. The prime example, of course, is the internet, which is allowing me to speak to you now. The internet didn't exist very recently. I remember very clearly the time when it didn't exist. Um, Somebody invented it. It slowly diffused. It started out, I believe, in the US military. Uh, it diffused within a small circle of early adopters, and then it got out and then very rapidly took off and spread so fast that now it's connecting the whole globe. Um, it's an example of one of the probably the fastest fastest diffusion of an innovation that's ever been recorded. And well, it's an interesting question: is how did it do so? Why? What happened along the way? Another example is, of course, the cell phone. Very fast diffusion again. Uh, at a point, it didn't exist again. Very recently, it didn't exist. Somebody invented it. It became an innovation. It got pushed, and now it's everywhere. Everett Rogers' book has a very good section on this. But these are, of course, very recent innovations that have spread very successfully. But there are, as I said, every man-made object around you is an innovation that diffused successfully. Something as simple as the glass pane in my window in front of me that I'm looking at. There was a time when there was no glass, man-made glass on this planet. Somebody invented how to make glass, and then somebody invented how to turn it into flat sheets of glass and how to use it as a pane in a window. And it was an innovation that then diffused from somewhere in the globe to other places over a certain amount of time, maybe faster or slower. There would have been resistance to it in different places for different reasons. And now, practically every building in every city and village in the world has glass panes in its windows. It's a very successful diffusion uh, of a very successful innovation. But then so are everything else that you see. Banal objects like tables. They didn't exist at some point. Lamps. Anything you look around you that's man-made is an innovation that's spread successfully. And this is terribly important for archaeologists because, after all, we study objects, primarily artifacts, and we can think of every artifact that we look at as an innovation that was invented somewhere, diffused, reached a certain limit, and then went out of fashion or stopped being used. Um, and one can approach archaeology as a study of these objects, the history of these objects. How did these things spread? Why did they spread from one place to another and not to another place? Things don't spread randomly. We're not talking about a Brownian motion of gas particles in the air. Objects diffuse in certain patterns. They go certain places, but not other places. Some places they go more slowly, and some places they go more quickly. And each object has a story to tell in its history of diffusion as an innovation. So there's plenty of material there for archaeological study, and I think it's an interesting way of looking at the world to think about objects as innovations and how did they diffuse and why. What's important to note is that most innovations actually fail to diffuse. Well over 90%, I would guess 99% maybe, of innovations fail to diffuse beyond a small circle of adopters. Um, the mono-wheeled vehicle, that didn't go very far. I never saw one, but it's a nice picture. The Dvorak keyboard, for example, is a nice example of a recent innovation. Well, it's supposed to be a vastly better and more efficient keyboard than the QWERTY keyboard that we're using. It increases speed of typing, it reduces the error rate, but it didn't diffuse. We don't see it in the shops. Why did it fail to diffuse? What was the resistance to this innovation? Well, I won't go into the details. Everett Rogers talks about it, and it's a fascinating story. But let me move on. Time is short, as I said, so there's a lot of things one can say about innovations that fail to diffuse. In a way, they're more interesting than the ones that were adopted. But let's move on. What is interesting and what I want to focus on is that all successful innovations diffuse in a similar pattern. This is a major finding of Everett Rogers, and it's the bit that's particularly important for archaeologists. Some innovations diffuse slower, others diffuse faster, but they all follow a similar pattern. And the pattern becomes visible when it's plotted as a cumulative graph. And all successful diffusions show the same S-curve. So as you can see on that graph, time is shown on the horizontal axis, and the percent of adoption is shown on the vertical axis. And all innovations start off at zero. At zero or a little bit past zero, there's an invention. It becomes an innovation that's being pushed by some innovators uh, who have perhaps a small circle of people around them who've adopted that innovation. And slowly over time, a few new adopters move in. There is a group of early adopters, people who enjoy trying new things, who are risk takers to some extent. And at this stage, when you reach about, let's say, 10, 20% of the adopting community has taken on that innovation, uh, it's not clear what's going to happen. The innovation can fail at this stage. It can fail to take off. It can simply flatline and become forgotten. The mono-wheeled vehicle might have reached a few early adopters and then just flatlined. But if it's a successful innovation, it takes off. It reaches a critical mass, usually around about 20% of the adopters. At that critical mass, then it sharply takes off, where over a short period of time, a large number of adopters jump on the bandwagon and take on that innovation. Of course, the speed can vary, um, but at that stage, past the takeoff point, the innovation can no longer be stopped. It takes off. And towards the top end of the graph, after about, let's say, 80-90% of the adopters have taken on the adoption, it starts to flatten out. The curve starts to flatten out because there are a few people left who haven't adopted. They're the late adopters and so on. What's important, the terribly important thing about this, and it's important for archaeology as well, is that all successful innovations follow this pattern. Also, the sequence in which a successful innovation is adopted is always the same. This is also very important. Earlier adopters tend to be wealthier, more cosmopolitan, more open-minded members of the community. They're the innovators and the early adopters who are sort of risk takers. They enjoy trying new things. And together, these add up to about 20%. Then there's a chasm. That's the deciding point about whether the innovation will succeed or not. And if it does succeed, an early majority jumps on the bandwagon, and then the late majority, and then at the very end, there are the laggards um, who basically wait till everybody else has taken on the innovation. Of course, there are some people who don't ever take on that innovation. So the early adopters have a certain social profile. They tend to be wealthier, more cosmopolitan, more open-minded members of the community. The later adopters tend to be more conservative and parochial individuals in the community. And as you go right on that bell graph, you're going from the more liberal, open-minded members to the more conservative, parochial members of the community. What Everett Rogers managed to show, and what hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of DOI studies subsequently dealing with different innovations in different parts of the world have shown, is that successful innovations always follow this pattern. This is what's useful for us. This is also terribly useful, and I'll come back to this point a couple more times in the show. There are 5 factors that determine the success and rate of diffusion, and these are the relative advantage, the degree to which an innovation is perceived as better than the idea it supersedes; compatibility, which is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as being consistent with existing values and needs of adopters; the complexity, which is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as difficult to understand and use. And you can imagine, if it's difficult to understand and use, it's not going to diffuse very fast. Trialability, the degree to which an innovation may be experimented with on a limited basis. Observability, which is the degree to which the results of an innovation are visible to others. So one can use these 5 factors to measure the success or lack of success in the diffusion of an innovation. And these are terribly useful factors. And again, this is a major contribution of Everett Rogers' theory. It allows us to measure the success of an innovation. Okay, let me give you a couple of case studies just to clarify some of the main points that I've raised here. And the most widely cited study, DOI study, is by Ryan and Gross, who looked at hybrid corn, what we call maize or mealies. Hybrid corn increased harvest by 20%, was more drought resistant, but farmers had to buy fresh seed every year. So there was some positives and negatives. And hybrid corn was innovated at the University of Iowa in the 1920s. And Ryan and Gross carried out a study, a landmark study, of how it diffused. They were interested to know um, why it diffused more quickly and more slowly in some places. So they studied the diffusion of this innovation in two rural Iowa communities and published in 1943 and 50 several papers during the middle of the 20th century. They studied a sample of 259 farmers and recorded the date of adoption, the communication channels that helped convince the farmers to adopt, how many acres each farmer planted with hybrid crop. They also recorded the farmer's level of education, farm size, income, frequency of travels to the city, readership of farm magazines, and many other social variables that they thought might be relevant. Their findings showed the cumulative graph of the results showed the typical S-curve of the successful diffusion of an innovation. As you can see in that chart on the right, the two communities of Scranton and Junction, 1927 was when the farmers started adopting, or the innovators came into the system. By about 1933, the early adopters had adopted the innovation. And then the takeoff point was around 33, 34, 35. And then very rapidly, the farmers in those two communities adopted hybrid corn. And by 1938, 39, the curve started to flatten out. The early adopters, Ryan and Gross found that the early adopters had larger farms, higher incomes, more formal education, and they were better traveled. But on average, nevertheless, it took 9 years from the first knowledge of hybrid corn to adoption. So it's not an overnight process. And typically, farmers heard of the innovation from salesmen, from innovators outside the community. But what persuaded them? It was the neighbors that were the most influential persuaders for the farmers. This is a very important point. And many hundreds of subsequent studies in many other fields in different parts of the world have confirmed these two key findings of Ryan and Gross. That first, although outsiders, the salesmen, the introducers of the innovation, are the introductory media, it's the neighbors, the insiders, who are the activating media in the diffusion process. And number two, the earlier adopters are the wealthier, more liberal, and cosmopolitan members of the society, and the later ones are more conservative and parochial. This is always the case, and there's no reason to doubt that in the archaeological past it worked out this way as well. The early adopters and the later adopters have particular social profiles, and that's always the same in every study. Most studies, like Ryan and Gross's, concern the role of individuals in the diffusion process. But a few studies, fortunately, have focused on the diffusion of innovations among organizations. I say fortunately because this is the more promising scale of analysis for archaeology, where prehistoric individuals are not visible, but archaeological cultures, which we can think of in terms of being organizations, archaeological cultures can be studied at the regional scale. So the classic case study for the diffusion of innovation among organizations was by Grettet, Jeunesse, and Curry on the spread of hate crime laws in the USA. They published their paper in 98 in the American Sociological Review. And they asked, how does criminalization diffuse over space and time? Now, California innovated hate crime laws in 1978. In 1981, its neighboring states, Oregon and Washington, had adopted similar laws. By 1995, all but 17 of the 50 states had adopted hate crime laws. And now, today, there remain, I think, only 3 states without these kinds of laws. Grattet et al. Concluded that the adoption of hate crime laws were most influenced by, first, the state's internal political culture and traditions, and second, as well as its location relative to other adopter states. So the more liberal, cosmopolitan, and wealthy states were the earlier adopters, These then influence their neighboring states to adopt as well. What's terribly important and interesting here is that essentially these are the same two key variables that influence the adoption of innovation among individuals. This is a map just to show the results of their study, the diffusion of hate crime laws in the USA, showing California in the far left as the innovator in 1978. Its northern neighbors, Oregon and Washington, were the first early adopters in 1981, and then Idaho, a neighboring state, there adopted as well. What's very interesting is that the innovation jumped over quite a few Midwestern states to find early adopters in the far east, in the east northeast of the United States, among the very liberal, wealthy, and cosmopolitan states of Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. So the being neighbors is not always essential. Sometimes the social variable, let's say the social profile, the traditions of the state play a bigger role. And then from about 85 to 90, a slew of neighboring states neighboring these early adopters started taking on the innovation. In the West, Nevada and Montana, and then a whole number of states around Illinois and Pennsylvania and New York. And then Florida in the South being a bit off on its own, but Florida is also a very cosmopolitan and wealthy and liberal state. So that might explain why it suddenly decided to jump on the bandwagon without having a neighboring state there. Uh, Late adopters were, again, the neighboring states of the next lot. And after 1994, there were still quite a few states that hadn't adopted. But as I said, today, the only states that have no hate crime laws, I think, are Wyoming, uh, Arkansas, and South Carolina. They are beyond the laggards. They haven't jumped on the bandwagon yet. Okay, let's turn to archaeology. Enough of the case studies, enough of the theory. What about archaeology? So far, the DOI approach is rare in archaeology, but I think it's very promising. As I said, every object has a history of its diffusion, and one can approach the study of objects in archaeology from that perspective. In South Africa, Alex Mackay, Brian Stewart, and Brian Chase considered this perspective in their study of lithic industries during the late Pleistocene period, where they tried to apply it to some degree to trying to explain the Howesans port. And I think that's a very promising point of view to do that. The problem, of course, is that when you're dealing with such distant period in the past, the chronological control is difficult. There are huge gaps in the database which prevent one getting a complete overview, but still they made a valiant effort, and I think it's promising to go in that direction. For our purposes, let me propose an exercise to apply the DOI approach to the diffusion of maize in Africa. And this is a quickie study just to show you how it might work or it might not. And I've used four principal sources here, an article by Marvin Miracle from 1965 on the introduction and spread of maize in Africa, a book by James McCann, 2005, called Maize and Grace. Again, it's a very worthwhile book to read through, packed full of interesting information on the spread of maize in Africa. Then, from the archaeological point of view and focusing in on South Africa, I've used an article by Jan Boyens and an article on maize grindstones by our recently departed Professor Tom Huffman. So the diffusion of maize in Africa has not yet ceased. We're still in the S-curve. 2 years ago, in Africa, maize was grown on about 43 million hectares of farmland, and this area had tripled since 1965. We're still in the upper reaches of the S-curve. How did we get here? Well, what we'll try and do in this exercise is to look back in time and see how and at what rate the diffusion of maize occurred in Africa. What this map on the right-hand side shows you is the countries that had a relatively high percentage of maize in their total national diet in 2002. And keep that pattern in mind because you'll see that it relates to how maize diffused in Africa. And the story of the diffusion of maize in Africa begins with the import of this crop from Brazil by Portuguese mariners. So as you know, maize was first domesticated in Mexico a long time ago, and it was brought over to the old world, let's say, by Portuguese mariners first in the 16th century, for as far as Africa is concerned. So in the first phase, we'll look at this early part. In the 16th century, Portuguese mariners introduced maize to several areas along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean rim of Africa. By the end of the 17th century, maize had spread far inland from the Gold Coast and the Angolan coast. The Portuguese brought it to the coastal areas, and then the spread inland was a question of neighbors adopting from or being introduced to the innovation by neighbors, and gradually the innovation spreading beyond the innovators on the coast among the neighboring communities inland. In the second phase, by about 1750, maize had also diffused far inland into East Africa from Zanzibar and Pemba Islands, and around that time, if not a little earlier, maize diffused to the Bornu Kingdom around Lake Chad from Venice via Egypt. I should point out there was also an early introduction into Ethiopia, but perhaps brought by Indian mariners from the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf area. And in a third phase, by about 1800, maize had diffused farther towards Central Africa from both east and west. It became a staple crop in much of East Africa and Mozambique around about this time. And around that time, it spread to the southeast coast of South Africa. So let's zoom in to South Africa. The two earliest adoptions of maize in South Africa were both failures. Jan van Riebeeck saw no maize at the Cape in 1652, so he imported it from Guinea in 1658, but the crop did not flourish in the winter rainfall zone of South Africa. And late Iron Age mining communities around Tabazimbi, about the same time, had maize grinding stones and may have obtained the crop from the Mutapa Kingdom in Zimbabwe, where a Portuguese priest introduced maize very early in 1561. But here, the droughts of 1700 in the Little Ice Age put an end to this early phase of maize farming in northern South Africa. So these two earliest adoptions of maize in South Africa didn't make it past the chasm. They were both failures. A more successful early adopter phase was during the first decades of the 19th century. Portuguese or Arab traders introduced maize to the coastal areas of KwaZulu-Natal. It may have also come in overland from Mozambique. Farther inland, European visitors recorded its use as a medicinal plant or a vegetable complement to sorghum. This is terribly important because it is clear that sorghum remained the principal grain among late Iron Age communities. Maize, there's no example of maize having supplanted sorghum to become the principal crop in late Iron Age times. Then maize became predominant during the transition from the mercantile to the industrial age. By the mid-19th century, maize was common, but sorghum was still the preferred food and dominant crop. And the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867, with its attendant labor migrations and urbanism, redefined maize from a garden vegetable to commodified grain, so that by 1930, maize had finally replaced sorghum as the principal grain food of South Africa. And the map shows you the so-called maize triangle where most of this crop was farmed and still is. So, how does a DOI perspective help us understand the history of maize in Africa? First, the history of the last 500 years shows that maize is still continuing to diffuse in Africa. Second, African communities went through a long phase of trialing maize, where the plant was used as a vegetable complement to the sorghum grain diet. And third, in all cases, maize first became the dominant crop when it served as a high energy food source for slaves and laborers. In DOI speak, then, the diffusion of maize in Africa was facilitated by its relative advantage. Maize was often perceived as more productive and less labor-intensive than African grains, and it provided a crop that could be harvested long before the main grains were ready. Compatibility, the maize plant even resembled sorghum in its early phases of growth, and it needed no new technology to grow. Complexity, maize was no more difficult to grow than sorghum and millet. Trialability, maize remained experimental and a subordinate of sorghum for a long time. And observability, the benefits and risks of growing maize would have been clearly visible to others. So what's new in all this for South African archaeology? Well, in the past, some researchers thought that dependence on drought-sensitive maize might explain the rise of the Zulu state and the subsequent Difficana civil wars in South Africa. Other researchers thought that maize cultivation may explain the extensive stonewall terracing in the Bokoni settlements in Mpumalanga province. And I thought that maize might actually explain the unusual size and complexity of Kweneng, which is a Sotho-Tswana capital near Johannesburg. Well, the DOI perspective now suggests that nowhere in South Africa during pre-colonial times was maize grown as the principal grain and in quantities that could have had such far-reaching effects. The power of maize can help explain the rapid growth of South Africa in the industrial age, but apparently not the rise of late Iron Age complex societies. Okay, well, so much for an exercise on applying DOI with, obviously, one can do a lot more with it by going into the detail of looking at just the diffusion of maize in a particular region. But again, the database is full of gaps, and of course, it would be better to have more coverage to be able to do a more thorough job of applying the DOI perspective. But it's an exercise that I find is a useful way of trying to understand archaeological and historical past. Let me finish with an epilogue, a short epilogue on can the DOI perspective help us understand where archaeology is going in South Africa? As you all know, very few Black South Africans have made a career of archaeology, and we can ask why. Why is that the case? Why is there resistance? Let us consider archaeology as an innovation that was introduced here to South Africa by outsiders. The outsiders have had much success, and many white South Africans have adopted the innovation. But the white early adopters only form a small minority of a country's population. And we can ask, why are the Black South Africans resisting this innovation? Let me put in a disclaimer. I've not done a systematic study, but my view is based on personal observations from a 30-year career of teaching archaeology to Black and white students in South Africa and Botswana. And it's also based on many informal conversations with Southern Africans, both rural and urban, both Black and white. And I really do believe that a systematic study carried out by someone from outside of archaeology on this question would be very, very useful indeed. But for what it's worth, let us examine the resistance via the five main factors that influence the adoption of an innovation. So relative advantage, in my view, Black South Africans generally do not seem to perceive archaeology as a better way of understanding their past. Their oral histories serve them much better. Compatibility, it seems to me that an archaeological reconstruction of the past is not perceived as being consistent with existing values and needs of Black South Africans. Rather, it is seen as a colonial perspective that primarily serves the needs of the whites. Complexity, I think that archaeological method and theory is perceived as difficult to understand and use. Trialability, archaeology as a profession, cannot be experimented with on a limited basis. One has to commit oneself to the discipline on faith. And observability, with so few Black South African influencers, the benefit of archaeology is not readily visible to Black South Africans. So in DOI speak, the innovation is still restricted to the early adopters, the chasm is still ahead of us, and there is a possibility that this innovation will fail to diffuse among Black South Africans. Recall that the outsider innovator's salesman can inform but not activate the majority of adopters. The innovators can only convince a few early adopters who have a particular social and educational profile. For the activation phase, it is the neighbors, so to say, who spread the word. And the further spread of the discipline among the majority of South Africans must therefore be achieved by the black early adopters. The innovators can't really help anymore beyond the early adopter phase. Will it work? Will archaeology diffuse successfully into the Black South Africa? Well, the Black early adopters will not convince the majority by publishing in scholarly journals. A more informal approach is required, and preferably it has to be delivered in an African language. So let me leave you with that for a thought, and I would like to extend my very best wishes to the next generation of South African archaeologists, and I would like to thank you all for your very kind attention.